After 30 years of faithful service to his country, Colonel Raymond Ellis just wanted to live his retirement in peace. The strange sore on his arm seemed like nothing more than another battle scar until he walked into that VA clinic. Dr. Martinez took one look at the wound and his face went white. The young doctor backed toward the door, stammering excuses, then left the room and locked it from the outside. Within minutes, the entire wing was under emergency lockdown. What could make a military physician panic at the sight of an old soldier's wound? The truth was buried in classified files from a mission in Southeast Asia that officially never happened. A mission where Ellis's unit encountered something in those dark jungles that still haunts the survivors. Now, decades later, that something has finally found him. But what does it want after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Ellis home, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that Margaret had polished to a warm gleam. Raymond sat in his favorite leather chair, the one that had molded itself too, his frame over 15 years of retirement mornings, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup like incense in a quiet church. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly, rolling hills dotted with cattle, and fenced with the kind of precision that spoke to a military man's need for order. This was the life he had dreamed of during those long nights in foreign countries, when the weight of command pressed against his chest like a physical thing. The peace of it still amazed him sometimes. No radios crackling with urgent reports, no maps to study, no lives hanging in the balance of his decisions. Just the soft tick of the mantel clock and Margaret's gentle humming from the kitchen as she prepared his breakfast. The wall across from his chair told the story of those other years, the ones that had earned him this tranquil ending. Framed certificates and medals arranged with military precision, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, and others whose significance only fellow soldiers would truly understand. Among them, a few ribbons whose meanings were buried in classified files, representing missions that officially never happened in places the government preferred to forget. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her silver hair catching the morning light like spun silk. At 61, she still moved with the grace that had first caught his attention at a USO dance 40 years ago, though worry lines now creased the corners of her eyes, lines that had deepened over the past month. "Ray, that thing on your arm is looking worse," she said, settling into the chair beside him with her own cup. Her voice carried the particular tone wives master after decades of marriage, the one that manages to be both gentle and insistent at the same time. Raymond glanced down at his left forearm, where the sleeve of his flannel shirt covered what had become an increasingly troublesome reminder that even a body as disciplined as his couldn't outrun time. The sore had appeared 6 weeks ago, starting as what looked like a simple scratch. Nothing unusual for a man who still insisted on doing his own yard work and maintaining the small ranch they built together, but this hadn't healed like normal wounds. Instead, it had developed into something peculiar, a cluster of perfectly round holes, each about the size of a pencil eraser, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The edges were rimmed with a discoloration that shifted between dark purple and an odd greenish hue, depending on the light. "It's probably just some kind of infection," Raymond said, though even to his own ears the words lacked conviction. He'd seen plenty of infected wounds during his years of service, and this didn't look like any of them. The holes were too clean, too geometric, and there was no sign of the inflammation or discharge he'd expect from a bacterial infection. Margaret reached over and touched his hand, her fingers warm and familiar. "Ray, I've been reading about these things online. There are some concerning possibilities we should rule out. Please, just go see Dr. Harrison. For me." Dr. Harrison was their family physician, a man Raymond's age who understood the particular reluctance of military men to seek medical attention for what they perceived as minor ailments. But Harrison was booked solid for 3 weeks, and Margaret's worried glances at his arm were becoming more frequent. "The VA clinic in town can see me today," Raymond said finally, recognizing the wisdom of addressing her concerns before they grew into full-blown anxiety. "It's probably nothing, but if it'll put your mind at ease." Margaret's smile was worth the inconvenience. After 37 years of marriage, her happiness remained his primary mission, more important than any objective he'd ever been assigned by the United States Army. The drive to the VA clinic took 20 minutes through countryside that never failed to remind him why he'd chosen this place to grow old. Rolling pastures gave way to the small downtown area, where American flags hung from every storefront and where everyone still knew everyone else's name. It was the kind of community that honored its veterans not with grand gestures, but with quiet respect and the assumption that a man's service spoke for itself. The VA clinic occupied a modest brick building that had once housed the town's original hospital. Inside, the waiting room held a familiar mixture of men his age and younger, all carrying the particular bearing that military service imprints on a person's posture and gaze. Some wore Vietnam veteran caps, others the newer desert camouflage, patterns from more recent conflicts. All of them shared the subtle signs of men who had served something larger than themselves. Raymond checked in with a receptionist who couldn't have been much older than his granddaughter, her smile professional, but genuinely warm. The paperwork was routine when had the symptoms started, any changes in his overall health, current medications. He filled it out with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to after-action reports. Though the stakes seemed considerably lower, Dr. Martinez appeared younger than Raymond had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with the earnest demeanor of someone still excited by the challenges of medicine. His handshake was firm, his manner respectful in the way that suggested he understood he was treating men who had served their country with distinction. "Colonel Ellis, I've reviewed your file," Dr. Martinez said as they walked toward an examination room. "Impressive service record. 30 years, multiple deployments, commendations across the board. What brings you in today?" The examination room was standard medical facility, bland beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying human anxieties that permeated such places. Raymond settled onto the paper-covered examination table, the crinkling sound bringing back memories of countless military medical checkups over the years. "My wife's concerned about a sore on my arm that's been slow to heal," Raymond explained, rolling up his sleeve. "Started about 6 weeks ago. Doesn't hurt much, but it's not getting better either." Dr. Martinez nodded, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "Let's take a look." The moment Dr. Martinez saw the wound, something changed in the room's atmosphere. The young physician's professional demeanor faltered for just an instant, so briefly that someone less observant might have missed it. But Raymond had spent 3 decades reading faces and body language, skills that had kept him and his men alive in situations where a misread expression could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure. Dr. Martinez leaned closer, his breathing slightly elevated. The cluster of holes seemed to capture his attention completely, as if he were seeing something that defied his medical training. He reached for a magnifying glass, studying the peculiar arrangement more closely, and Raymond noticed the doctor's hand wasn't quite steady. "Have you experienced any other symptoms?" Dr. Martinez asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Headaches, changes in sleep patterns, any unusual sensations around the affected area?" "Nothing significant," Raymond replied, though now that he considered it, there had been some changes. Dreams that felt more vivid than usual, sometimes featuring places and people he hadn't thought about in years. A strange tingling sensation that occasionally emanated from the wound, usually at night when he was trying to sleep. But these seemed like minor details, hardly worth mentioning. Dr. Martinez made notes on his tablet, but his eyes kept returning to the wound. "Colonel, I'm going to step out for just a moment to consult with a colleague. I'll be right back." The young doctor's departure felt abrupt, and the click of the door closing behind him carried a finality that made Raymond's military instincts stir. In 30 years of service, he'd learned to trust those instincts, and right now they were telling him that Dr. Martinez hadn't simply gone to consult with a colleague. Raymond remained sitting on the examination table, but his posture had shifted subtly. Where moments before he'd been a retired veteran seeking routine medical care, he was now a colonel assessing a potentially hostile situation. His eyes swept the room methodically, noting details he'd overlooked during his initial casual survey. The positioning of the furniture, the location of exits, the types of locks on the cabinets. Outside the room, he could hear muffled conversations, voices with the kind of urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine medical consultation. Someone mentioned protocols. Another voice referenced procedures that weren't standard for civilian medical care. Raymond's experience with classified operations allowed him to recognize the particular tone people used when discussing matters that weren't supposed to be discussed. When Dr. Martinez returned 15 minutes later, he wasn't alone. 2 other individuals accompanied him, a woman in a white coat who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, and a man in civilian clothes whose bearing screamed federal agent despite his attempt to appear casual. "Colonel Ellis," Dr. Chun said, extending her hand with a grip that was both professional and somehow apologetic. "I'm Dr. Chun, and I specialize in unusual medical presentations. Dr. Martinez has asked me to take a look at your condition." The word unusual hung in the air like a challenge. Raymond had encountered enough military bureaucracy to recognize when he was being managed rather than informed. "What exactly makes my condition unusual, doctor?" he asked, keeping his voice level but allowing just enough edge to indicate he wasn't going to be placated with vague medical jargon. Dr. Chen exchanged a glance with the unnamed man before answering. "Colonel, we'd like to run some additional tests, just to be thorough. The pattern and presentation of your lesion is something we'd like to document more carefully." Raymond looked from Dr. Chun to Dr. Martinez to the silent man in civilian clothes. His instincts, honed by years of command decisions, were now sending clear signals that whatever was happening here went well beyond routine medical care. The young doctor who had been confident and professional 30 minutes ago now looked like someone who had stumbled into a situation far beyond his training. "I think," Raymond said carefully, "that before we proceed with any additional tests, I'd like to call my wife and let her know there might be a delay." The moment of silence that followed his request confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. Dr. Chen nodded too quickly. The unnamed man shifted his weight in a way that suggested he was preparing to prevent rather than facilitate, and Dr. Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Of course," Dr. Chun said. "But Colonel, I think it would be best if we could get started with the tests first. Time may be somewhat important." Raymond Ellis had commanded soldiers in combat zones where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. He'd negotiated with hostile forces, managed classified operations in countries whose names never appeared in official reports, and survived situations that would have broken lesser men. The current situation didn't involve bullets or bombs, but his trained instincts recognized a developing crisis just the same. "Doctor," he said, sliding off the examination table with deliberate care, "I've spent 30 years following orders, and another 15 years enjoying the freedom to make my own decisions. Right now, I'm deciding that I'd like to understand exactly what's happening before we proceed any further." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either honest explanation or serious escalation. Raymond stood quietly, a man who had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful action is patient stillness, and waited to see which direction this unexpected morning would take him. The silence stretched until Dr. Chun cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Colonel Ellis, I understand your concern, and you have every right to know what's happening. The truth is, your wound displays characteristics that we've only seen in a very specific type of case." "What type of case?" Raymond asked. Though he was beginning to suspect the answer would connect to parts of his military service he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Martinez finally spoke, his voice slightly unsteady. "Colonel, when I first looked at your lesion, I recognized the pattern from a training seminar. There's a protocol for this specific presentation, Emergency Medical Containment Protocol 7 Delta. The designation meant nothing to Raymond, but the way Dr. Martinez pronounced it suggested it meant a great deal to the medical staff. The unnamed man stepped forward for the first time. "Colonel Ellis, I'm Agent Morrison with the Department of Veterans Affairs, Special Investigations Unit. We need to ask you some questions about your service record, specifically regarding any overseas deployments between 1990 and 1995. Raymond felt something cold settle in his stomach. Those were the years of his final active assignments, the classified missions that had earned him promotions and commendations he couldn't discuss with his wife or anyone outside of a secure facility. The years when he'd led small teams into places that didn't exist on official maps, pursuing objectives that were never recorded in traditional military records. I'm not sure I understand the connection between my service record and a medical condition," Raymond said, though he was beginning to understand all too well. Dr. Chun pulled up a chair, her expression shifting from clinical detachment to something approaching compassion. "Colonel, in the past 3 months, we've seen 17 cases of veterans presenting with lesions identical to yours. All of them served in classified operations in Southeast Asia during the early 1990s. All of them were part of small unit operations that involved extended jungle patrols." The room seemed to shrink around Raymond. 17 cases. He thought of the men who had served under his command during those years. Good soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home safely. Most of them had made it back, but some hadn't and had struggled with the transition to civilian life in ways that went beyond typical post-deployment adjustment. What happened to those 17 men? Raymond asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. Agent Morrison consulted a tablet before responding. 14 are deceased. 2 are currently under medical supervision. You're the 3rd we've been able to locate for immediate evaluation. The weight of command, something Raymond thought he'd left behind with his uniform, settled back onto his shoulders like a familiar burden. 14 dead. Whatever they had encountered in those jungle operations wasn't finished with them yet. "I want to call my wife," Raymond said firmly. "And I want to understand exactly what you think is happening before we proceed with any medical evaluation." Dr. Chun nodded. "Colonel, we can arrange for you to call your wife, but there are some precautions we need to take first. The lesion you're presenting isn't just unusual. It appears to be actively changing at a cellular level. We need to ensure that whatever process is occurring doesn't pose a risk to others." Before Raymond could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the medical facility. Not the standard fire alarm or medical emergency signals he'd heard during previous visits, but something urgent and unfamiliar. The fluorescent lights in the examination room flickered and shifted to an amber backup system. Dr. Martinez's face went pale. "That's the containment protocol alarm." Agent Morrison was already speaking into a small communications device. "Control, this is Morrison. Confirm protocol 7 Delta activation. Request immediate facility lockdown." The voice that responded was crisp and professional. "Confirmed. All sections sealed. External communications suspended. Hazmat teams en route." Raymond stood slowly, his military training automatically cataloging the changed circumstances. Sealed facility meant no civilian access, no phone calls, no contact with the outside world until whatever crisis they believed was developing had been resolved. In his experience, such measures were only taken when the situation had already moved far beyond anyone's control. "Dr. Chun," he said with the calm authority that had carried him through 3 decades of military service, "I think it's time you told me exactly what you believe is happening to me." Dr. Chun glanced at Agent Morrison, who nodded grimly. She walked to a computer terminal and pulled up what appeared to be a classified file with multiple security clearance warnings. "Operation Silent Grove," she said quietly. 1994. Your unit was tasked with investigating reports of an unusual biological agent being developed in remote jungle facilities. The mission report indicates that your team successfully destroyed the target facility, but that you encountered some kind of unknown pathogen during the operation. The memories hit Raymond like a physical blow. Operation Silent Grove, the mission that had been classified so far above top secret that even now, 3 decades later, he had never spoken about it to anyone, not even Margaret during his worst nightmares. The jungle had been wrong from the beginning. Not just dangerous in the way that hostile territory is always dangerous, but wrong in a way that made experienced soldiers nervous without being able to articulate why. The indigenous guides had refused to approach within 10 kilometers of their objective, claiming the area was cursed. At the time, Raymond had dismissed their concerns as local superstition. His team had found the facility exactly where intelligence had indicated, a collection of buildings hidden beneath the jungle canopy, apparently abandoned but showing signs of recent activity. The structures themselves had been unremarkable, but what they had found inside defied every assumption about biological warfare research. "We destroyed the facility," Raymond said slowly, the words feeling strange after decades of silence. "Whatever research was being conducted, there was terminated. According to the medical officer's report filed after your return," Dr. Chun continued, 3 members of your 8-man team showed signs of exposure to an unknown biological agent. All 3 were quarantined, underwent extensive medical evaluation, and were eventually cleared for return to duty when no active infection could be detected. Agent Morrison stepped forward. "Colonel, we believe that the pathogen you encountered has remained dormant in certain individuals for 30 years. Something has triggered its activation, and the lesions you and the other affected veterans are developing represent the first stage of that activation." Raymond felt the room shift around him as the implications sank in. Not just his own condition, but the 14 men who had died, the 2 under medical supervision, and potentially others who hadn't yet been identified or located. First stage of what? He asked. Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "We don't know. The pathogen displays characteristics unlike anything in our current understanding of biological organisms. It appears to be creating some kind of communication network through the lesions, but we don't understand its purpose or ultimate objective." A soft chiming sound came from somewhere in the room, and Raymond noticed that the cluster of holes on his arm had begun to emit a faint, barely perceptible glow. The sensation he'd been experiencing at night, the tingling, the strange dreams suddenly intensified. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard something that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite thought, a whisper that seemed to come from inside his own mind, but carried the unmistakable feel of communication from somewhere else. Dr. Martinez backed toward the door, his fear no longer concealed. "Dr. Chun, the readings are spiking. Whatever's happening, it's accelerating." Through the examination room's small window, Raymond could see people in hazmat suits moving through the facility's corridors. The amber emergency lighting gave everything a surreal, otherworldly quality that reminded him uncomfortably of those final hours in the jungle facility 30 years ago. "Colonel," Agent Morrison said urgently, We need you to remain calm and cooperate with our medical team. Based on what happened to the other affected veterans, we believe you may be experiencing the early stages of a process that could be extremely dangerous." Raymond looked down at his arm, where the strange glow was becoming more pronounced. The whisper in his mind was growing clearer, though he still couldn't make out distinct words or meaning. Whatever had been sleeping in his body for 3 decades was finally waking up, and he was beginning to understand that the young doctor's panic hadn't been an overreaction. It had been completely appropriate. The examination room door opened, and 2 figures in full hazmat gear entered, carrying medical equipment that looked more suited to a research laboratory than a small-town VA clinic. Whatever was happening to him, whatever process had begun in a jungle on the other side of the world 30 years ago, was about to enter its next phase, and Raymond Ellis, retired colonel and devoted husband who had just wanted to live out his remaining years in peace, found himself once again at the center of a classified operation whose outcome could determine whether he lived to see another Montana sunrise. Dr. Sarah Chen had never expected her expertise in exotic pathology to lead her to a small Montana VA clinic, but the classified file on her secure tablet contained enough disturbing information to justify the emergency flight from Atlanta. As she reviewed the heavily redacted mission reports from Operation Silent Grove, she couldn't shake the feeling that 30 years of assumed safety had been built on dangerously incomplete information. The facility's isolation ward had been hastily established in what had previously been the building's administrative wing. Through the reinforced glass, she could observe Colonel Ellis as he submitted to the initial battery of tests with the patient dignity of a man accustomed to following orders. He didn't fully understand. What concerned her wasn't his compliance, but the subtle changes she was already documenting in his behavior and physiology. The lesion on his arm continued to emit its strange bioluminescence, pulsing in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic. More troubling were the brain scans showing unusual neural activity in regions associated with long-term memory and sensory processing. Whatever the pathogen was doing, it wasn't just affecting his physical condition. Agent Morrison appeared beside her, carrying a thick folder marked with security classifications she recognized but had never personally encountered. "Dr. Chun, we've located the surviving members of Colonel Ellis's unit from Operation Silent Grove. The picture isn't encouraging." She accepted the folder and began reviewing the contents. 8 men had participated in the mission. 3 had shown immediate signs of exposure and undergone quarantine procedures, Ellis and 2 others. Of those 3, 1 had died in a car accident in 1998. The second had succumbed to what appeared to be a particularly aggressive cancer in 2003. Ellis was the only survivor of the originally affected trio, but the other 5 team members, those who had shown no immediate signs of exposure, told a different story. 2 had died by suicide within 5 years of returning from the mission. Another had struggled with severe PTSD and died of a drug overdose in 2010. The remaining 2 had maintained relatively normal lives until recently. Recently meaning? She asked. Thomas Rodriguez died 3 months ago. Official cause of death was heart failure, but the autopsy revealed the same type of lesions that Ellis is presenting. Rodriguez's family said he'd been experiencing vivid nightmares and claiming he could hear voices calling his name. Dr. Chun felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's aggressive air conditioning. And the last team member? Staff Sergeant Michael Park. We've been trying to locate him for the past week. His family says he disappeared from his home in Oregon 2 weeks ago. Left a note saying he had to go back and finish what we started. The implications were staggering. If the pathogen could remain dormant for 3 decades before activating, and if it was somehow affecting men who had shown no initial symptoms, then their understanding of exposure and transmission was fundamentally flawed. Inside the isolation room, Colonel Ellis was experiencing his own revelations. The medical tests had been extensive, but familiar blood draws, neurological examinations, detailed questioning about his symptoms and recent experiences. What was less familiar was the growing clarity of the whispers in his mind. They weren't random sounds or the confused static of a damaged brain. The more he listened, the more he became convinced that someone or something was trying to communicate with him. The voice seemed to carry emotional undertones, urgency, perhaps even fear, but also something that felt almost like recognition. During a brief break between tests, when the hazmat-suited medical staff had stepped out to review results, Raymond found himself focusing on the strange sensations emanating from his arm. The bioluminescent glow had stabilized into a steady, soft radiance, and the whispers had become clearer. Not words in any language he recognized, but something deeper and more direct. Images began forming in his mind, not his own memories, but something else entirely. Dense jungle vegetation, but seen from an unusual perspective. Structures that looked organic rather than constructed, and something that might have been other beings. Though their forms were unclear and constantly shifting, a memory surfaced unbidden. The final night of Operation Silent Grove, when his team had been preparing to extract after destroying the research facility. They had made camp in what seemed like a safe clearing, but throughout the night, Raymond had felt as though they were being observed. Not by human sentries, but by something else that watched from the darkness with intelligent awareness. He had dismissed the feeling at the time, attributing it to combat stress and the natural paranoia that came with operating in hostile territory. But now, 30 years later, he was beginning to wonder if that sense of being watched had been entirely accurate. The isolation room's door opened, and Dr. Chen entered alone, having shed the cumbersome hazmat suit for more conventional protective gear. Her expression was serious, but not unkind. "Colonel Ellis, I've been reviewing the mission files from Operation Silent Grove, and I need to ask you some specific questions about what your team encountered." Raymond nodded. After 30 years of silence, the prospect of finally discussing that mission felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. "What do you need to know?" "The official report indicates that your team destroyed a biological research facility and eliminated all materials and personnel. But there are gaps in the timeline that suggest something else happened during those final hours." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, marshaling memories he had spent 3 decades trying to suppress. "The facility wasn't what we expected. The intelligence briefing suggested we'd find a conventional laboratory setup. Maybe some enhanced interrogation research or chemical weapons development. But that's not what you found." "No." Raymond's voice was barely above a whisper. "What we found was something that challenged everything we thought we knew about biological warfare. The research wasn't being conducted on traditional pathogens. They were studying something that had been discovered in the deep jungle, something that appeared to be intelligent." Dr. Chun leaned forward slightly. "Intelligent how?" "The creatures, for lack of a better word, seemed to respond to our presence in ways that suggested awareness and intention. They weren't acting on instinct or simple biological programming. They were making decisions." The glow from Raymond's arm pulsed more brightly as he spoke, and the whispers in his mind intensified. For just a moment, the fragmented images became clearer. His own team, as seen from outside their position, moving through the jungle with the heavy, focused intent of soldiers on a mission they didn't fully understand. "Colonel," Dr. Chun said gently, "what happened to those creatures?" Raymond met her eyes, and she saw the weight of 3 decades' worth of carried secrets. "We killed them, all of them, as far as we could determine. It was our mission, and we completed it successfully. But you were exposed to something during the process. 3 of us showed immediate symptoms, a kind of localized infection that the medical team couldn't identify, but eventually declared resolved. The other 5 team members appeared to be unaffected." Dr. Chung consulted her tablet before responding. Colonel, I need to tell you something that may be difficult to hear. Of your original 8-man team, you're the only one still alive. The last to die was Thomas Rodriguez, 3 months ago. Before he died, he left a message with his family. She played an audio recording on her tablet. Rodriguez's voice, strained and uncertain. Ray, if you're hearing this, then it's starting for you too. The dreams, the voices, the feeling that something's calling you back. I tried to resist it, but I don't think we can. I think they're still alive, Ray. I think what we did in the jungle wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. The whispers in Raymond's mind suddenly became clear, resolving into something that wasn't quite language, but carried unmistakable meaning. We remember you. We have been waiting. It is time to complete what was interrupted. Raymond looked down at his arm, where the cluster of holes had begun to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and realized that his quiet retirement had just come to a permanent end. Margaret Ellis had been a military wife for 37 years, which meant she had developed an finely tuned sense for when something was seriously wrong. Raymond's failure to return from what should have been a routine medical appointment, combined with the busy signals she'd been getting from the VA clinic for the past 4 hours, triggered every alarm bell that experience had taught her to recognize. She sat at her kitchen table with her phone, a notepad, and the same methodical patience that had carried her through countless deployments and military emergencies. The clinic's main number continued to give her a recorded message about temporary service interruptions due to facility maintenance. The emergency number she'd found online connected her to a voicemail system that claimed all operators were busy. Military wives learn to work around official channels when those channels become unresponsive. Margaret began calling the families of other veterans she knew, asking if anyone else had experienced unusual difficulties reaching the VA clinic. By the third call, she had confirmation that something was definitely wrong. My husband went there yesterday for a routine checkup, said Linda Morrison, whose husband had served with a different unit, but during the same general time frame as Raymond. I haven't heard from him since. When I drove by this morning, the parking lot was full of vehicles I've never seen before, and there were people in some kind of protective suits. Margaret felt the familiar cold knot forming in her stomach, the one that had accompanied every deployment notification and emergency briefing she'd received during Raymond's active service. She thought of the strange wound on his arm, the way it had seemed to disturb him more than he'd been willing to admit, and the subtle changes in his sleep patterns over the past month. Meanwhile, at the VA clinic, Raymond was discovering that his situation was more complex than anyone had initially realized. The voice in his mind had become clearer throughout the day, and with that clarity had come the disturbing realization that he wasn't its only recipient. Colonel, Dr. Chen said during what she'd described as a consultation, but felt more like an interrogation. We've been monitoring your brain activity, and we're seeing some unusual patterns. The neural activity we detected earlier appears to be intensifying, and it's showing characteristics that suggest external stimulation. External meaning what, exactly? We believe you may be receiving some form of communication from an outside source. The pathogen appears to have created a biological communication system that we don't fully understand. Agent Morrison joined them, carrying a tablet with what appeared to be real-time data feeds. Colonel Ellis, we've made contact with Staff Sergeant Park. He's been located at a site in Oregon that corresponds to coordinates from your original mission briefing. Raymond felt the whispers in his mind suddenly intensify, and with them came a flood of images that were definitely not his own memories. Dense jungle vegetation, but viewed from ground level, as if through the eyes of something moving stealthily through the undergrowth. Structures that seemed to grow rather than having been built. And other beings, shadowy forms that communicated without sound. What's Park's condition? Raymond asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He's developed lesions similar to yours, but more advanced. The local medical team describes them as having formed a complex pattern across his torso and both arms. He's conscious and responsive, but he claims to be receiving detailed instructions about returning to Southeast Asia. The weight of command, dormant for 15 years, settled back onto Raymond's shoulders like a familiar uniform. Park had been one of his best soldiers, reliable and intelligent, but also someone who followed orders without question. If something was compelling him to return to the site of their original mission, the implications were staggering. "I want to talk to him," Raymond said. Dr. Chun exchanged a glance with Agent Morrison before nodding. "We can arrange a secure communication link." The video call connected them to a medical facility in Oregon that looked remarkably similar to the one where Raymond was being held. Staff Sergeant Michael Park appeared on the screen, and Raymond had to suppress his shock at the man's appearance. Park had always been lean, but now he looked gaunt, almost hollow. More concerning were the visible lesions that covered his exposed arms and neck, forming intricate patterns that pulsed with the same soft bioluminescence Raymond recognized from his own condition. "Colonel," Park said, and his voice carried the same mixture of respect and familiarity it had 30 years earlier. "I've been hoping they'd let me talk to you." "Sir, I think we made a mistake back in '94. "What kind of mistake, Sergeant?" Park's expression was troubled but determined. "I don't think those things we killed were the enemy, Colonel. I think they were trying to communicate with us, and we misunderstood their intentions." The whispers in Raymond's mind suddenly coalesced into something approaching coherent thought. Asterisk. The young soldier speaks truth. The violence was unnecessary. Communication was attempted but not understood. Asterisk. Raymond's hand moved unconsciously to his arm, where his own lesions were responding to the exchange with increased activity. "Sergeant, what exactly are you experiencing?" "Dreams, sir. But not regular dreams, more like shared memories. I can see events from the perspective of the creatures we encountered. They weren't trying to harm us or develop weapons. They were trying to understand us, to make contact." Dr. Chun leaned into the camera's view. "Sergeant Park, our medical team needs to understand the nature of these communications you're receiving. Can you describe the process?" Park looked uncomfortable, but answered with military directness. "It's not like hearing voices, ma'am. It's more like suddenly knowing things you didn't know before, having access to thoughts and memories that aren't your own. And the more it happens, the clearer it becomes that these beings have been trying to reach us for 30 years. Agent Morrison stepped forward. "Sergeant, are you saying that you believe the pathogen is some form of communication technology?" "Sir, I don't think it's a pathogen at all. I think it's something more like a biological internet, a way of sharing information and experiences across large distances. And I think the reason Rodriguez died, the reason the others from our team had so many problems, is because they were fighting it instead of trying to understand it." Raymond felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. The voice in his mind, which he had been interpreting as an invasion or infection, suddenly felt more like an offered handshake, an attempt at contact from something that had been patiently waiting for him to stop fighting long enough to listen. "Sergeant Park," he said quietly, "what do you believe they want from us?" Park's answer was immediate and certain. "To finish what we interrupted, Colonel. To complete the communication that our attack cut short. And, sir, I don't think we have much choice in the matter. The process has already begun." Dr. Sarah Chun's laboratory had become the epicenter of what was rapidly developing into a crisis that challenged every assumption about biological warfare, interspecies communication, and the nature of intelligence itself. The specimen container she had discovered in a forgotten storage facility outside of Atlanta contained traces of organic material that had been collected during Operation Silent Grove, and then apparently misfiled for 30 years. Under high-powered microscopy, the samples revealed structures unlike anything in conventional biological taxonomy. The organisms appeared to be neither plant nor animal, but something that incorporated characteristics of both while displaying behaviors that suggested a level of organization typically associated with much more complex life forms. Agent Morrison, she said, calling him over to the microscope station she had hastily established in the VA clinic's converted conference room. You need to see this. Morrison bent over the eyepiece and spent several minutes examining the sample. When he straightened, his expression was grim. Dr. Chun, I'm not a scientist, but that doesn't look like any pathogen I've ever seen described. Because it's not a pathogen, she replied. At least not in any conventional sense. What we're looking at appears to be a form of biological technology, a living system designed to facilitate communication and information exchange. She adjusted the microscope settings, bringing different aspects of the sample into focus. Look at these neural-like structures. They're creating networks, forming connections with each other in patterns that suggest active information processing. And these responses to electrical stimulation, they're too organized, too purposeful to be simple biological reflexes. Morrison studied the display for a long moment. Are you saying that Colonel Ellis and the others aren't infected with a disease? That they're actually interfaced with some kind of alien communication system? That's exactly what I'm saying. And based on the readings we're getting from both Ellis and Sergeant Park, the system is becoming more active. The organisms have been dormant for 30 years, but something has triggered them to resume whatever process Ellis's team interrupted in 1994. In his isolation room, Raymond was experiencing the full implications of Dr. Chen's discovery firsthand. The whispers had evolved into something that felt more like shared consciousness, not losing his own identity, but gaining access to perspectives and memories that belonged to something utterly foreign. Through this strange connection, he was beginning to understand what had actually happened during Operation Silent Grove. His team had been sent to investigate reports of biological weapons research, but what they had found was something far more complex, a first contact situation that no one had been prepared to recognize or handle appropriately. The facility they had destroyed hadn't been a weapons laboratory. It had been a communication center built by the indigenous organisms as a way of attempting contact with the human researchers who had stumbled upon them in the deep jungle. The creatures had been trying to establish peaceful communication when Raymond's team had interpreted their approach as an attack. The shared memories were vivid and emotionally overwhelming. He experienced the confusion and terror of the organisms as armed soldiers had burst into their carefully constructed communication space. He felt their desperate attempts to signal peaceful intent, attempts that had been interpreted as hostile. Action by men trained to respond to threats with decisive force. Most devastating of all, he experienced their grief as the systematic destruction of their communication network had cut them off from their own kind, leaving the few survivors isolated and unable to return to their home territory. They weren't trying to hurt us, Raymond said aloud, though no one was in the room to hear him. They were refugees, cut off from their own people, trying to make contact with us to ask for help. The door to his isolation room opened, and Dr. Chen entered carrying a thick folder and a tablet displaying real-time biological data. Her expression was troubled but determined. Colonel Ellis, I need to share some information with you that's going to be difficult to hear. We've been analyzing the organisms that your team encountered in 1994, and we've made some disturbing discoveries. She pulled up a chair and opened the folder. The creatures you described as hostile and dangerous appear to have been members of a species that was displaced from their original habitat by human development projects. They had been trying to establish communication with the research team at the facility, not to harm them, but to request assistance in finding a way to return to their home territory. Raymond nodded slowly. I know. They've been showing me their memories of what happened. Dr. Chun looked surprised. The communication is that detailed? It's more than communication, Raymond replied. It's more like sharing consciousness. I can experience their memories as if they were my own, and I think they're experiencing mine the same way. Colonel, there's something else. We've identified similar cases in other countries, veterans from other military operations who are experiencing identical symptoms. This isn't limited to your team from Operation Silent Grove. The organisms appear to have been attempting contact with military personnel around the world for decades. She pulled up satellite imagery on her tablet. These are current photographs from locations in Southeast Asia, Central America, and parts of Africa. All areas where similar military operations took place in the 1990s, and all showing signs of renewed biological activity that matches what we're seeing in the samples from your mission. Raymond studied the images, recognizing the same types of organic structures he was seeing in his shared memories. They're rebuilding their communication networks. That's our assessment. And, Colonel, based on the timeline and the geographic distribution, we believe that the activation of dormant organisms in veterans like yourself is part of a coordinated effort to re-establish global communications. The implications were staggering. What had been dismissed as isolated medical anomalies was actually evidence of a planet-wide attempt by a displaced species to reconnect with their scattered members. And the veterans who had been involved in disrupting their original communication, attempts were being recruited voluntarily or otherwise to help complete the process. Dr. Chun, Raymond said carefully, what happens if we refuse to cooperate? She was quiet for a long moment before responding. Based on what happened to your deceased team members, I don't think refusal is a viable option. The organisms appear to be capable of overriding human biological systems when necessary. But, Colonel, I'm not convinced that cooperation would necessarily be harmful to us. What do you mean? The shared consciousness you're experiencing, are you still yourself? Do you retain your own memories, your own personality, and decision-making capabilities? Raymond considered the question. Despite the strange new perceptions and the access to alien memories, he was still fundamentally himself. If anything, the experience was expanding his understanding rather than diminishing his humanity. I'm still me, he said. But I'm also something more than I was before. Dr. Chun nodded. That's consistent with what Sergeant Park reported before he disappeared from the Oregon facility. Raymond looked up sharply. Park disappeared? 3 hours ago. Security footage shows him walking out of the building unassisted, but his biological readings suggest the communication process had reached a much more advanced stage. Colonel, I think we're running out of time to understand what's happening before it progresses beyond our ability to influence the outcome. Captain Morrison's audio log had been discovered among Raymond's personal effects during a security sweep of his home, a precautionary measure that Agent Morrison had authorized as the situation at the VA clinic continued to escalate beyond all previous protocols. The recording device, a small digital unit that Raymond had apparently forgotten he possessed, contained 43 minutes of testimony that changed everything the government thought it knew about Operation Silent Grove. Margaret Ellis sat in the security briefing room at the clinic, listening to the voice of a man who had been dead for 15 years, describing events that had been classified far beyond her security clearance. But Agent Morrison had decided that the circumstances warranted sharing information with family members, particularly given the indications that the biological process affecting Raymond was accelerating. Captain Morrison's voice, strained and exhausted. Personal log, November 15th, 1994. This is my final report on Operation Silent Grove. And if anyone ever finds this recording, they need to know that the official mission report is incomplete and deliberately misleading. Margaret gripped the edge of the table as her husband's commanding officer continued. The facility we were sent to investigate wasn't conducting weapons research on captured specimens. The creatures we encountered were voluntary participants in a communication project initiated by the research team. Dr. Elizabeth Hendricks had made contact with an indigenous species that demonstrated clear signs of advanced intelligence and peaceful intentions. Agent Morrison paused the recording. Mrs. Ellis, this completely contradicts the official mission reports that your husband and his team filed. Why would they file false reports? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because, Agent Morrison replied, someone in the command structure wanted Operation Silent Grove to be classified as a successful military action rather than as a first contact scenario that had gone tragically wrong. He restarted the recording. Captain Morrison's voice continued. The creatures had been attempting to establish communication with human researchers for several months. Dr. Hendricks reported that they displayed remarkable intelligence and appeared to be refugees from an area that had been destroyed by logging operations. They weren't hostile, they were asking for help. Margaret felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. Her husband, the man who had spent 30 years carrying the guilt of what he believed was a necessary military action, had actually been the unwitting participant in what amounted to the murder of peaceful refugees. When my team arrived, the recording continued. The situation was already deteriorating. Military intelligence had classified the creatures as hostile based on incomplete reports, and my orders were to eliminate the threat and destroy all evidence of biological weapons research. Colonel Ellis and his men followed those orders perfectly, but they were acting on false information. Agent Morrison stopped the recording again. Mrs. Ellis, there's more, but it becomes quite disturbing. Are you prepared to continue? Margaret nodded, though she felt as though the foundation of everything she thought she knew about her husband's military service was crumbling beneath her. The truth is that the creatures were attempting to surrender when we opened fire. They had developed a biological communication system that allowed them to interface directly with human consciousness, not to control or harm, but to share information and establish mutual understanding. Dr. Hendricks had been participating in successful communication sessions for weeks before we arrived. The weight of 30 years of her husband's nightmares and subtle guilt suddenly made terrible sense to Margaret. Raymond had been carrying the burden of what he believed was a necessary but difficult military action, when in reality it had been an act of genocide against beings who had been trying to establish peaceful contact at that moment. In his isolation room, Raymond was experiencing the full emotional impact of the same realization. The shared consciousness had progressed to the point where he could access not just the creature's memories of the attack, but their understanding of human motivations and military protocols. They had known, even as his team opened fire, that the soldiers were acting on incomplete information. They had felt the humans' fear and confusion, their genuine belief that they were eliminating a threat to their own species. The creatures' final communications hadn't been expressions of hatred or revenge, but something approaching forgiveness mixed with profound sadness. The young warriors did not know. Came the thought that was somehow both his own and utterly foreign. The deception came from others who feared what unity might bring. Raymond sat up straighter as the implications hit him. The creatures hadn't just been refugees seeking help. They had been offering something that certain elements within the military and government establishment had found threatening enough to suppress through deliberate misinformation. They were offering us a solution, he said aloud. And this time, Dr. Chun was there to hear him. She looked up from her tablet, where she had been monitoring his vital signs. A solution to what, Colonel? To the isolation, Raymond replied, struggling to put the complex concepts he was receiving into human language. They had developed a way for different species to share knowledge and understanding directly, without the barriers that lead to conflict and misunderstanding. Dr. Chun moved closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. "Colonel, are you saying that the biological interface they created was intended to be a form of universal translation system? More than translation. A way of sharing actual experience and perspective. Imagine if every human conflict could be resolved by allowing each side to literally experience the situation from their opponent's point of view." The profound implications of what he was describing weren't lost on Dr. Chun. A species that had developed true empathy as a biological function would represent a revolutionary step in social evolution. And the military application, the ability to end conflicts through understanding rather than force, would fundamentally alter the nature of human warfare. "Dr. Chun," Raymond continued, "I think I understand now why the official reports were falsified. Someone in the command structure realized what we had encountered and decided that humanity wasn't ready for that kind of evolutionary leap." Dr. Chun consulted her tablet again, reviewing data that had been accumulating throughout their conversation. "Colonel, your neural activity is showing patterns that suggest you're receiving information in real time. The communication isn't just sharing stored memories. You're in active contact with surviving members of their species." Raymond nodded. "They've been waiting for 30 years, hoping that eventually some of us would be ready to complete the interrupted communication. The activation of the biological interface in the veterans from various military operations isn't random. It's a carefully planned attempt to re-establish contact with humans who have the experience and authority to potentially influence policy decisions." "And the other governments around the world? Are they experiencing similar contact attempts?" "Yes, but the responses vary. Some countries have been more receptive to the possibility of peaceful contact. Others have repeated the same mistakes we made in 1994. Treating any unexplained biological phenomenon as a potential weapon." Dr. Chun's expression was troubled. "Colonel, what happens if we can't convince our own government to approach this situation with the appropriate level of openness and scientific curiosity?" The answer came to Raymond not from his own military experience, but from the shared consciousness that now gave him access to perspectives he had never imagined possible. "Then the species will eventually abandon their attempts at voluntary communication and resort to more direct methods of ensuring their survival. They've been patient for 30 years, but their situation is becoming desperate. The environmental destruction that displaced them originally is accelerating, and they need human cooperation to find viable solutions." Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who realized she was at the center of a situation that could determine the future relationship between humanity and its first confirmed contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. "Colonel Ellis, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Based on your current level of communication with these beings, do you believe they represent a threat to human civilization?" Raymond considered the question with the benefit of perspectives from both his human military experience and the alien consciousness that was now part of his awareness. The answer was complex, but ultimately clear. "Dr. Chun, they represent a threat only if we continue to approach them as enemies rather than as potential partners. But if we maintain the assumption that contact must be prevented or controlled through military force, then yes, they will eventually defend themselves with capabilities we don't fully understand and can't effectively counter." The implications hung in the air like a challenge to everything Dr. Chun had been trained to believe about first contact protocols and national security priorities. Outside the isolation room, she could hear the sounds of additional military personnel arriving at the facility, and she realized that the window for choosing a peaceful resolution might be closing faster than anyone had anticipated. The neural interface map that Dr. Chun discovered in the classified files changed everything. hidden within decades-old research data from a project that officially didn't exist. The diagram showed biological networks of stunning complexity, not the crude infection vectors they had assumed, but sophisticated communication systems that represented a level of biological engineering far beyond human capabilities. "Agent Morrison," Dr. Chun called urgently. "You need to see this immediately." The map displayed on her computer screen showed interconnected biological pathways that resembled nothing so much as a three-dimensional internet, with nodes representing individual conscious beings and data flowing between them in real time. But what made the diagram revolutionary was its demonstration that the system had been designed specifically for cross-species compatibility. "This isn't a pathogen," she said, her voice filled with amazement and growing alarm. "This is the most advanced biological technology we've ever encountered, and it's been specifically engineered to interface with human consciousness." Agent Morrison studied the display, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe. "Dr. Chun, are you telling me that what we've been treating as a medical emergency is actually evidence of a species that's developed biological-based internet technology? More than that, look at these compatibility matrices." She pointed to sections of the diagram that showed how the alien biological systems adapted themselves to interface with different types of neural structures. They've created a universal communication system that can establish understanding between any two intelligent species, regardless of their evolutionary background or communication methods. Raymond, meanwhile, was experiencing the full implications of this discovery firsthand. The shared consciousness had reached a level of integration where he could access not just individual memories, but the collective knowledge and experience of an entire species. And what he learned there fundamentally altered his understanding of everything that had happened over the past 30 years. The creatures his team had encountered in Southeast Asia hadn't been indigenous to Earth. They were refugees from a world that had been destroyed by environmental collapse, a collapse caused by the same type of industrial development and resource exploitation that was beginning to threaten Earth's ecological stability. Their arrival on Earth hadn't been an invasion, or even an intentional colonization. They had been fleeing their dying world in small groups, seeking temporary refuge while they searched for a permanent home. The biological communication system they had developed was their species' greatest achievement, a technology that had allowed them to resolve conflicts and manage resources through genuine mutual understanding rather than competition and warfare. But more shocking than their refugee status was the realization that they had been trying to offer this technology to humanity as a gift. The communication attempts that military forces around the world had been suppressing for decades weren't efforts to control or infiltrate human society. They were desperate attempts to share the knowledge that could help humanity avoid the same environmental catastrophe that had destroyed their home world. "They're not trying to take over," Raymond said aloud as Dr. Chun entered his isolation room. "They're trying to save us." Dr. Chun set down her tablet and looked at him with an expression that mixed scientific fascination with growing concern. "Colonel, the neural interface technology they've developed, you're saying it was intended as a solution to prevent warfare and environmental destruction?" "Not just prevent," Raymond replied. "His understanding enriched by access to perspectives that span multiple worlds and civilizations. Dr. Chun, they've made contact with 17 different intelligent species over the past 1,000 years. In every case where the species accepted the biological communication technology, conflicts ended and environmental problems were resolved through cooperative problem solving. And in the cases where species refused?" Raymond was quiet for a moment, accessing memories that carried the emotional weight of witnessing civilizations destroy themselves through their inability to move beyond competitive thinking. Extinction, not through war with the refugees, but through the same patterns that had been destroying their worlds before contact was attempted. The species that refused the communication technology continued to compete for resources and territory until their environments collapsed beyond recovery. Dr. Chun felt something cold settle in her stomach as the implications became clear. "Colonel, are you saying that acceptance of this biological communication system is effectively mandatory for species survival?" "Not mandatory in the sense of coercion," Raymond explained, struggling to translate concepts that had no direct equivalent in human language. "But mandatory in the sense that any species advanced enough for space travel will eventually face resource limitations that can only be solved through genuine cooperation. The communication technology doesn't force cooperation, it makes cooperation possible by eliminating the misunderstandings and fear that prevent intelligent beings from working together effectively." The sound of heavy vehicles arriving outside the facility interrupted their conversation. Through the isolation room's small window, they could see military transport trucks and personnel carriers, not the medical support vehicles that had been arriving steadily throughout the day, but combat units with the equipment and bearing of soldiers prepared for serious conflict. "Dr. Chun," Raymond said urgently, "I think we're running out of time. The response from Washington isn't going to be scientific curiosity and diplomatic outreach. They're going to approach this as a military threat that needs to be eliminated." Dr. Chun checked her tablet and confirmed Raymond's assessment. New orders had just come through, authorizing full containment protocols and the termination of all potentially compromised personnel. The language was bureaucratic. The meaning was clear: kill the infected veterans and destroy all evidence of the contact attempts. "Colonel, the shared consciousness you're experiencing, can you communicate our situation to the other members of their species? Can you tell them that not all humans support a military response?" Raymond closed his eyes and focused on the biological network that now connected him to perspectives he was still learning to navigate. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. "Dr. Chun, there are 43 other humans around the world who are currently connected to their communication network. Some are military personnel like Park and myself, but others are scientists, diplomats, even a few political leaders who were exposed during various contact attempts over the years. That's good news, right? It means there are people in positions of authority who understand the real situation. The good news is that we're not alone in trying to prevent a repeat of what happened in 1994. The bad news is that military forces in several countries are converging on the locations of connected individuals. It's not just the United States that's chosen a military response." Dr. Chun realized that they were looking at the potential for a global catastrophe if multiple governments simultaneously attacked their own personnel who were serving as communication links to the refugee species. It would likely end any possibility of peaceful contact and force the aliens to defend themselves with technologies that human military forces couldn't understand or counter. "Colonel," she said quietly, "what happens if they decide that humanity isn't ready for peaceful contact?" Raymond's answer came not from his own military experience, but from the shared consciousness that gave him access to the history of 17 different first contact scenarios. They leave. They abandon Earth and search for refuge elsewhere in the galaxy. But Dr. Chun, based on their previous experiences, they estimate that humanity has less than 50 years before environmental collapse makes the planet uninhabitable for complex life forms. If they leave now, we lose our only chance to access the knowledge and technology that could prevent the same fate that destroyed their home world. The communication array that formed as Raymond fully accepted the biological interface represented humanity's first glimpse of what interspecies cooperation could accomplish. As the connection stabilized, he found himself linked not only to the refugee species, but to the 43 other humans around the world who had reached similar levels of integration with the alien communication system. The experience was overwhelming. At first, suddenly, having access to perspectives from 6 different continents multiple cultures, and a range of professional backgrounds from molecular biologists to tribal elders who had maintained traditional knowledge about the natural world. But what emerged from this cacophony of human experience was a surprisingly coherent understanding of the situation and a growing consensus about how to respond. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a xenobiologist at the University of São Paulo, was connected. Through an exposure that had occurred during a research expedition in the Amazon basin. Through the shared consciousness, Raymond could experience her scientific excitement at finally having proof that life could evolve along completely different pathways while still achieving intelligence and technological sophistication. Colonel James Mackenzie, British Special Forces, had encountered the same species during a classified operation in Central Africa in 1996. His military training allowed him to assess the tactical situation with professional clarity humanity was facing. A first contact scenario for which no existing protocols were adequate. And most world governments were defaulting to military responses that would almost certainly prove catastrophic. But perhaps most importantly, the network included Dr. Elena Vasquez, a microbiologist who had been serving as an unofficial advisor to the United Nations on biological warfare treaties. Her connections to international diplomatic channels provided a potential avenue for circumventing the military responses that were developing in various national governments. Raymond, came Dr. Vasquez's voice through the biological communication system. I've been monitoring government communications through my UN contacts. At least 6 countries have authorized military action against their own personnel who are showing signs of alien interface. We have perhaps 12 hours before coordinated attacks begin. Through this shared consciousness, Raymond could access the tactical assessments that Colonel Mackenzie was providing in real time. Military units were positioning around facilities where infected personnel were being held, with orders to eliminate what their commanders believed were compromised individuals who posed potential security threats to their respective nations. The irony, Mackenzie's thoughts contributed to the group consciousness, is that they're about to destroy the only people capable of preventing a much larger conflict. If they kill us, the refugee species will have no choice but to conclude that humanity is too dangerous for peaceful contact. Raymond focused his attention on his own immediate situation. Through the isolation room's window, he could see military vehicles continuing to arrive at the VA clinic. The personnel emerging from them wore the gear and carried the equipment of soldiers, preparing for a hazardous materials, situation protective suits, specialized weapons, and the grim determination of men who believed they were preventing a biological catastrophe. Dr. Chun appeared at his door, but instead of entering, she spoke through the intercom system. Colonel Ellis, I've been ordered to evacuate the facility. Military personnel are taking over the operation under emergency biological warfare protocols. Raymond nodded, understanding the implications. Dr. Chen's evacuation meant that the scientific approach to the situation was being abandoned in favor of a military solution, one that would likely involve the elimination of anyone considered to be compromised by alien influence. Dr. Chun, he said, before you leave, I need you to understand something. The communication system we're dealing with isn't just connecting me to an alien species. It's connecting me to other humans around the world who are in similar situations. We're forming a network that could potentially facilitate peaceful contact and information sharing. Colonel, are you saying that there's a possibility of resolving this situation without military intervention? I'm saying that the military intervention is precisely what will prevent a peaceful resolution. The refugee species has been hoping for 30 years that humans would eventually be ready for cooperative contact. If we respond to their outreach attempts by killing the people they're trying to communicate with, they'll reasonably conclude that we're too hostile for peaceful relations. Through the shared consciousness, Raymond could feel the growing urgency from his connected colleagues around the world. Dr. Vasquez reported that UN Security Council meetings were being convened to address what was being described as a global biological warfare emergency. Dr. Martinez confirmed that Brazilian military forces were surrounding the research station where she was being held. Colonel Manzi indicated that British authorities had already begun what they euphemistically termed containment procedures. But perhaps most distressing was the report from Staff Sergeant Park, who had managed to reach a position of greater integration with the communication system before his facility had been militarized. Through him, they were receiving direct emotional input from the refugee species themselves, and what they were experiencing was a profound sense of déjà vu mixed with despair. "They've seen this before," Park's consciousness shared with the group, "on 14 different worlds in contact attempts spanning over 1,000 years. The pattern is always the same: initial peaceful outreach, followed by military response from the contacted species, followed by the abandonment of that species to work out its own survival problems." Raymond felt the weight of representing not just his own species, but potentially the future of human civilization. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether humanity joined a galactic community of species that had learned to cooperate for mutual survival, or whether Earth became another cautionary tale of a species that destroyed itself through its inability to move beyond competitive thinking. The door to his isolation room opened, and instead of Dr. Chun, 3 figures in full hazmat gear entered. Their equipment was military rather than medical, and their bearing suggested they weren't there to conduct additional tests. "Colonel Ellis," the lead figure said through a voice modulator. "I'm Major Thompson, U.S. Army Medical Research Command. We're here to implement emergency containment protocols." Raymond recognized the terminology. Emergency containment protocols, in the context of biological warfare response, typically involved the complete elimination of potentially compromised individuals and the sterilization of all associated materials and locations. "Major Thompson," Raymond said with the calm authority of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions under pressure, "I think there are some aspects of this situation that haven't been fully explained to you by your superiors. Sir, my orders are clear and non-negotiable. You've been classified as compromised by hostile biological agents, and standard protocols require immediate termination of potential infection vectors." Through the biological communication system, Raymond could feel the reactions of his connected colleagues around the world. Similar confrontations were occurring at their locations, military personnel implementing containment protocols based on assumptions that were not only incorrect, but catastrophically counterproductive. "Major," Raymond continued, "before you implement those protocols, I'd like to share some information that might be relevant to your assessment of the situation." "Colonel Ellis, sir, I have great respect for your service record, but my orders come from the highest levels of command and are based on intelligence that classifies your current condition as a threat to national security." Raymond made a decision that would either save or doom any possibility of peaceful human contact with the refugee species. Through the biological communication system, he reached out to his connected colleagues and proposed a coordinated response, not military resistance, which would confirm official fears about their compromise, but a demonstration of what interspecies cooperation could actually accomplish. "Major Thompson," he said, "what if I could prove to you that the situation is not what your intelligence briefings have described? What if I could demonstrate that what you've been told is a biological warfare attack is actually an attempt at peaceful contact from a species that has the knowledge to solve some of humanity's most pressing problems?" Major Thompson's response was predictable. "Sir, any demonstration involving the suspected biological agent would be considered an act of aggression and would trigger immediate implementation of containment protocols." Raymond nodded, understanding that he was about to make a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of human civilization. Through the shared consciousness, he could feel his connected colleagues around the world facing similar moments of decision. The time for half measures and gradual revelation had passed. If humanity was going to have a chance at peaceful contact with the refugee species, it would require a demonstration dramatic enough to overcome decades of military conditioning and institutional fear. "Major Thompson," Raymond said quietly, "then I guess we're all about to find out whether humanity is ready to join a larger community of intelligent species, or whether we're determined to repeat the same mistakes that have destroyed civilizations across the galaxy." The broadcast signal that Raymond and the global network initiated represented humanity's first coordinated attempt at interspecies communication, but it also marked the beginning of what could either be peaceful contact or catastrophic conflict, as military forces around the world prepared to eliminate what they perceived as compromised personnel. The connected humans made a decision that would force the entire planet to confront the reality of non-human intelligence. "Now," Raymond said through the biological communication system, and 43 human consciousnesses around the world simultaneously opened themselves fully to the refugee species communication network. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Every satellite communication system on Earth began receiving coordinated transmissions that bypassed normal electromagnetic channels entirely. Television broadcasts, internet connections, radio communications, and military networks suddenly carried identical messages in every human language simultaneously, not through technological interference, but through biological transmission systems that the refugee species had been developing for 1,000 years. Major Thompson's voice modulator crackled with interference as the broadcast began. Through speakers, screens, and communication devices around the world, humanity heard its first message from a non-terrestrial intelligence. "Human beings of Earth, we are refugees from a world destroyed by the same environmental and social conflicts that now threaten your planet. For 30 years, we have attempted peaceful contact through individual communications with your military personnel, scientists, and leaders. These attempts have been repeatedly interpreted as attacks and responded to with violence." The message continued in Raymond's voice, but carrying the accumulated knowledge and perspective of the refugee species. "We are not invaders. We are not conquerors. We are survivors of a civilization that failed to achieve the cooperation necessary for long-term survival. We have spent the past 1,000 years traveling between worlds, offering to share the knowledge that could prevent the same fate from befalling other intelligent species." Major Thompson had stopped approaching Raymond and was frantically speaking into his communication device, trying to reach commanders who were presumably receiving the same broadcast. Around the world, similar scenes were playing out as military personnel found themselves confronting a situation that had moved far beyond their established protocols. The biological interface that your governments have classified as an infection is actually a communication system designed to allow genuine understanding between different species. The humans who have accepted this interface are not compromised or controlled. They remain fully themselves while gaining access to knowledge and perspectives that could help humanity solve problems that threaten your continued survival. Through the global network, Raymond could feel the reactions of his connected colleagues. Dr. Vasquez was simultaneously coordinating the broadcast and monitoring United Nations communications channels, watching as world leaders struggled to respond to a situation that challenged every assumption about human uniqueness and planetary security. Dr. Martinez was documenting the biological processes involved in the communication, providing real-time scientific data that would be crucial for convincing skeptical researchers that the contact was genuine. Colonel Mackenzie was using his military expertise to assess global response patterns, identifying which government and military leaders were most likely to respond with continued aggression versus those who might be open to diplomatic engagement. For the past 30 years, the broadcast continued. Your species has been approaching a critical decision point. Environmental degradation, resource competition, and social conflict are accelerating toward conditions that will make complex life unsustainable on Earth within your children's lifetimes. We have seen this pattern on 17 other worlds. In some cases, species accepted our offered knowledge and developed sustainable, cooperative civilizations. In other cases, species rejected cooperation and experienced complete social and environmental collapse. The military vehicles outside the VA clinic had stopped their methodical approach and were apparently receiving new orders through communication channels that were now carrying mixed signals, some authorizing continued containment operations, others calling for immediate withdrawal pending further analysis of the unprecedented global broadcast. Raymond could see Major Thompson through his helmet's visor, and the man's expression had shifted from grim determination to confused uncertainty. The soldier was clearly receiving conflicting orders from a command structure that had no protocols for dealing with a coordinated alien communication that was being transmitted globally through their own personnel. The choice before humanity is simple, but not easy. Raymond's voice continued, though the words carried the accumulated wisdom of a species that had witnessed both successful and failed first contact scenarios across multiple civilizations. You can continue to approach interspecies contact as a military threat to be eliminated, in which case we will respect your decision and search elsewhere for refuge. Or you can accept that your survival as a species may depend on learning to cooperate not only with each other, but with other forms of intelligence that share this galaxy. Through the biological network, urgent messages were flowing between the connected humans and the refugee species. The coordinated military response that was developing around the world had triggered what appeared to be evacuation protocol among the aliens' preparation to abandon Earth and continue their search for refuge elsewhere in the galaxy. We are not asking for territorial concessions or political control, the broadcast explained. We are offering to share knowledge about sustainable technology, biological systems that can repair environmental damage, and communication methods that make genuine cooperation possible between different species and cultures. But this offer requires trust, and trust requires that you stop treating contact attempts as military emergencies. Major Thompson finally approached Raymond directly, but instead of implementing containment protocols, he removed his helmet and looked directly at the man who had become the primary communication link between humanity and its first confirmed contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. "Colonel S," he said, his voice carrying the confusion of a professional soldier who had discovered that his mission assumptions were fundamentally incorrect. "Are you telling me that this entire situation could have been resolved through diplomatic contact instead of military containment?" Raymond nodded, feeling the weight of 30 years of missed opportunities and unnecessary fear. "Major, everything that's happened since 1994 could have been avoided if someone in the chain of command had been willing to consider that first. Contact might involve cooperation rather than conquest." "Sir, what happens now?" "My orders were to eliminate potential biological warfare threats, but if this is actually a diplomatic situation, then military action could make things much worse." Through the global communication network, Raymond could sense that similar conversations were occurring at connected sites around the world. Military personnel who had been prepared to eliminate compromised individuals were discovering that they were potentially about to prevent the most important diplomatic contact in human history. "Major Thompson," Raymond said, "what happens now depends on whether humanity is willing to take a chance on cooperation with a species that has knowledge we desperately need, or whether we're going to let fear and military conditioning drive used toward the same isolation that has destroyed every other species that refused interspecies contact." The broadcast continued, but now it included voices from the other connected humans around the world: scientists, military personnel, and civilians who had become unwilling ambassadors for their species. This communication is being transmitted simultaneously to every government, military command, and scientific institution on Earth. The choice belongs to all of humanity, not to individual military commanders or political leaders. We are your fellow humans, and we remain fully human despite our connection to the refugee species. But we are also your only current link to knowledge and perspectives that could determine whether your children inherit a sustainable world or a dying planet. Major Thompson lowered his weapon and spoke into his communication device. Command, this is Thompson, requesting immediate clarification of mission parameters. The situation on the ground does not match our intelligence briefings, and I believe we may be dealing with a diplomatic rather than a military scenario. The response that came back was fractured and uncertain, reflecting a command structure that was struggling to adapt to circumstances that had moved far beyond their preparation or expectations. Raymond realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the broadcast succeeded in opening peaceful dialogue or triggered a military response that would end any possibility of human cooperation with the refugee species. Through the biological network, he could sense the aliens preparing for immediate departure if human governments chose continued military action over diplomatic engagement. The moment of decision had arrived, and it belonged not just to Raymond Ellis or the other connected humans, but to the entire human species. The unity symbol that appeared on Raymond's skin as he completed the full merger with the alien consciousness represented more than successful communication. It marked humanity's first step toward joining a galactic community of species that had learned to survive through cooperation rather than competition. The mark resembled a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift and pulse with soft bioluminescence. But to those who understood its meaning, it represented hope for a future that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Around the world, the global broadcast had achieved what 30 years of classified operations and military responses had failed to accomplish. It had forced humanity to confront the reality of non-terrestrial intelligence and make a conscious choice about how to respond. The reactions varied dramatically by region and government, but the overall pattern was encouraging. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, Secretary General Maria Santos was convening an emergency session that included not only traditional diplomatic representatives, but scientists, military advisors, and for the first time in UN history, direct communication links to the refugee species through connected humans like Dr. Vasquez. The evidence is overwhelming. Dr. Vasquez reported through both traditional communication channels and the biological network that now connected her to her colleagues around the world. We're dealing with a species that has successfully facilitated peaceful contact with multiple civilizations over the past millennium. Their offer to share knowledge about sustainable technology and cooperative social structures represents the most significant opportunity in human history. President Chun of the European Federation was among the first world leaders to publicly acknowledge the legitimacy of the contact. The demonstrations we've witnessed today: coordinated global communications, real-time sharing of complex scientific data, and the maintenance of human individuality within an interspecies network provide compelling evidence that we're dealing with benevolent rather than hostile intelligence. But not all responses were positive. Military commanders in several countries continued to advocate for containment and elimination protocols, arguing that any form of alien influence represented an unacceptable security risk, regardless of its apparent peaceful intentions. Major Thompson, who had become an unexpected witness to the transformation occurring in Raymond, found himself serving as a primary source of information for military leadership struggling to understand the situation. "Sir," he reported to his superiors, "Colonel Ellis remains completely himself, same personality, same memories, same decision-making patterns. The only change is that he now has access to additional information and perspectives that appear to be genuinely beneficial. Raymond, meanwhile, was experiencing the full implications of successful interspecies communication. Through the biological network, he had access not only to the refugee species' knowledge about sustainable technology and environmental restoration, but to their memories of other worlds where similar first contact situations had occurred. Some of those memories were encouraging. On 7 different worlds, species had overcome their initial fear and suspicion to develop cooperative relationships that led to remarkable advances in technology, medicine, and social organization. These civilizations had gone on to become part of a loose galactic community that shared knowledge and assisted each other in times of crisis. But other memories were sobering reminders of what could happen when species chose isolation over cooperation. 10 worlds had rejected interspecies contact, usually through military responses similar to what had initially occurred on Earth. In every case, those civilizations had eventually collapsed under the weight of environmental degradation and resource conflicts that could have been avoided through cooperative problem-solving. Dr. Chun, Raymond said as she returned to the facility, having been recalled when the military containment operation was suspended pending further evaluation. I need you to understand something about the choice we're facing. This isn't just about whether we accept help from a refugee species. It's about whether humanity is willing to evolve beyond the competitive thinking that has brought us to the brink of environmental collapse. Dr. Chun had been reviewing the scientific data that was flowing through the global network, detailed information about biological systems that could clean atmospheric pollution, agricultural techniques that could restore damaged ecosystems, and energy technologies that could provide abundant power without environmental destruction. Colonel, the knowledge they're offering to share, it's not just advanced beyond our current capabilities. It's advanced beyond what we thought was theoretically possible. If even half of this information proves accurate and implementable, we could solve climate change, resource scarcity, and most forms of environmental degradation within a generation. And the cost? Raymond asked, though he already knew the answer from the shared consciousness. There is no cost in terms of political control or territorial concessions. But there is a requirement for genuine cooperation, not just between humans and the refugee species, but between different human cultures and nations. The technology they're offering only works effectively when implemented cooperatively rather than competitively. Through the biological network, Raymond could sense the growing consensus among world leaders. The initial fear and military responses were giving way to cautious optimism as the reality of the situation became clear. The refugee species wasn't seeking to control or replace human civilization. They were offering to help humanity avoid the same fate that had destroyed their original world. Margaret Ellis, who had been watching the global broadcast from the clinic's waiting area, was finally allowed to see her husband. The reunion was emotional, but also profound, as she realized that the man she loved had become something more than human while remaining fundamentally himself. "Ray," she said, touching the unity symbol that glowed softly on his arm. "Are you still my husband?" "I'm still your husband," he replied, "but I'm also something more. I have access to knowledge and perspectives that could help ensure our grandchildren inherit a world worth living in. And Margaret, through this connection, I can finally understand and help heal some of the trauma from those missions I could never talk about." The biological communication system, it turned out, was remarkably effective at treating post-traumatic stress and other forms of psychological damage. By allowing individuals to experience events from multiple perspectives and to share their emotional burdens with others who truly understood, it facilitated healing in ways that traditional therapy had never achieved. Around the world, other military veterans who had been connected to the network were reporting similar experiences. The guilt, nightmares, and emotional isolation that had plagued many of them for decades were being resolved as they gained access to the broader context and meaning of their service. Colonel Mackenzie reported from London, "The healing aspect of this communication system may be as important as the technological knowledge they're offering. We're looking at a potential solution to PTSD, depression, and other forms of trauma-related mental health issues." As the day drew to a close, the initial crisis had transformed into the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The military containment operations had been suspended, replaced by scientific and diplomatic teams tasked with facilitating ongoing communication with the refugee species. The connected humans had become humanity's first interspecies ambassadors, bridging the gap between two very different forms of intelligence. Government officials who had spent the morning planning military strikes were now coordinating the establishment of formal diplomatic protocols for continued contact. The United Nations was preparing to create a new department specifically dedicated to interspecies relations, with Dr. Vasquez as its first director. "The transformation has been remarkable," she reported through both traditional and biological communication channels. "What began as fear-based military responses has evolved into genuine scientific and diplomatic curiosity. Humanity appears to be choosing cooperation over isolation." Raymond felt a profound sense of relief flowing through the global network. The refugee species, who had been preparing to abandon Earth after yet another failed contact attempt, were now cautiously optimistic about the possibility of establishing a permanent cooperative relationship with humanity through the shared consciousness. He experienced their collective memory of successful interspecies partnership civilizations that had not only survived environmental and social challenges, but had thrived through cooperative problem-solving and mutual support. For the first time in 30 years, the refugees had reason to believe they might finally find a permanent home. "Dr. Chun," Raymond said, "I think we've just witnessed humanity pass its most important test. The question now is whether we can maintain this level of cooperation long enough to implement the changes that will ensure our mutual survival." The unity symbol on his arm pulsed gently, a visible reminder that he was no longer just Colonel Raymond Ellis, retired military officer. He had become a bridge between species, carrying the hopes and knowledge of beings who had traveled across the galaxy in search of refuge and cooperation. Outside the clinic, the military vehicles were being replaced by research equipment and communication facilities. The crisis was over, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the day that changed everything, Raymond Ellis stood in a memorial garden that had become both a symbol of transformation and a testament to the power of understanding over fear. The living monument stretched across 3 acres of what had once been empty land behind the VA clinic, but now served as humanity's first interspecies memorial, a place where both human veterans and the refugee species could honor their fallen while celebrating the cooperation that had emerged from conflict. The garden itself was unlike anything that had existed before on Earth. Traditional human landscaping merged seamlessly with the organic architectural techniques of the refugee species, creating structures that seemed to grow rather than having been built. Trees and flowers from Earth flourished alongside transplant vegetation from the aliens' destroyed homeworld, species that had been preserved in biological storage systems for the 1,000-year journey between stars. Raymond walked the winding paths each morning, often accompanied by Margaret, who had adapted to her husband's transformation with the grace and flexibility that had carried her through 37 years of military life. The unity symbol on his arm had settled into a steady, soft glow that seemed to pulse in harmony with the bioluminescent plants that marked significant locations throughout the memorial space. "It's remarkable how quickly people have adapted," Margaret observed as they paused beside a fountain that incorporated both human engineering and alien biotechnology. The water flowed in patterns that seemed almost alive, responding to the presence of visitors with subtle shifts in color and movement. "Fear is powerful," Raymond replied, his voice carrying the measured wisdom that had developed through months of serving as one of humanity's primary ambassadors to the refugee species. "But hope is stronger, especially when it's backed by tangible evidence that cooperation leads to better outcomes than competition." The evidence had indeed been compelling. In the 6 months since formal diplomatic contact had been established, humanity had gained access to technologies and knowledge that were already beginning to address some of civilization's most pressing challenges. Atmospheric processors developed by the refugee species were removing carbon dioxide and other pollutants from the air at rates that exceeded the most optimistic projections of human environmental scientists. Agricultural techniques that combine alien biological engineering with human farming expertise were producing unprecedented crop yields while actually improving soil health. Perhaps most importantly, the biological communication system that had initially been feared as a form of alien control had proven to be remarkably effective at resolving human conflicts. When opposing parties could literally experience situations from each other's perspectives, finding mutually acceptable solutions became not just possible, but inevitable. Dr. Sarah Chun had established the world's first interspecies medical research center at Johns Hopkins, where human and alien medical knowledge were being combined to develop treatments for conditions that had previously been considered incurable. The refugee species' understanding of biological systems, combined with human surgical and pharmaceutical expertise, was revolutionizing medicine at a pace that surprised even the most optimistic researchers. The PTSD treatment protocols we've developed using the biological communication system have been extraordinarily successful, the Dr. Chun reported during one of her regular briefings to the International Oversight Committee. Veterans who have been struggling with trauma-related symptoms for decades are experiencing complete resolution of their conditions within weeks of beginning treatment. The treatment worked by allowing patients to experience their traumatic memories from multiple perspectives, including those of their fellow service members, civilians who had been helped by their actions, and even when appropriate, former enemies who since found peace and reconciliation. The broader context and deeper understanding that resulted from these shared experiences transformed traumatic memories from sources of ongoing pain into integrated components of personal growth and wisdom. Colonel Mackenzie had become the director of the International Veterans Healing Program, coordinating similar treatment efforts around the world. His reports consistently showed success rates that far exceeded traditional therapeutic approaches, with the added benefit that many veterans who completed the program chose to continue using the biological communication system to help others facing similar challenges. "The healing isn't just individual," Mackenzie explained during a global conference on interspecies cooperation. "When veterans can share their experiences and perspectives with others who truly understand the context and complexity of military service, it creates a supportive community that benefits everyone involved." Staff Sergeant Park had returned from his wandering journey through the Pacific Northwest, where he had spent several weeks in direct communication with refugee species members who had established a small settlement in the remote mountains. His reports of that experience had provided crucial insights into how human and alien communities might eventually coexist on the same planet. "They're not trying to replace human civilization or create separate territories," Park explained to government officials who were still working out the practical details of long-term interspecies cooperation. "They want to integrate with existing human communities in ways that benefit both species while respecting the autonomy and cultural preferences of all involved." The integration was proceeding gradually but steadily. In several locations around the world, small groups of refugee species members had established residence within human communities, contributing their knowledge and perspectives while learning about human culture and social organization. The results had been universally positive, with both human and alien residents reporting high levels of satisfaction with the cooperative arrangements. Margaret had initially worried that Raymond's transformation would fundamentally change their relationship, but she had discovered that the opposite was true. The biological communication system had given him access to perspectives that helped him understand and appreciate their marriage in ways that had never been possible before. He could experience their relationship from her point of view, understanding the sacrifices she had made and the strength she had shown during his years of active service. In some ways, she told friends who asked about life with a husband who was connected to an interspecies communication network, "Ray is more himself now than he's ever been." The guilt and emotional isolation that he carried for so many years have been resolved, and he's able to be fully present in ways that weren't possible when he was struggling with unprocessed trauma. The memorial garden had become a pilgrimage destination for people around the world who wanted to experience the tangible evidence of successful interspecies cooperation. But for Raymond, it served a more personal purpose, a place where he could honor the memory of his fallen comrades while celebrating the transformation that had emerged from their shared sacrifice. On the morning of the 6-month anniversary of first contact, he stood before a living memorial that bore the names of the 14 veterans from various operations who had died before the true nature of the alien contact attempts had been understood. The memorial itself was a hybrid creation human craftsmanship combined with alien biotechnology to create a structure that would continue growing and changing for centuries to come, a living testament to the possibility of cooperation between different forms of intelligence. "They would have been proud," Margaret said softly as she joined him before the memorial. "All those years of carrying guilt about missions they couldn't discuss, and it turns out they were actually part of the most important diplomatic contact in human history." Raymond nodded, feeling the presence of his fallen comrades not as ghosts from a troubled past, but as pioneers who had unknowingly helped pave the way for humanity's entry into a larger galactic community. Through the biological communication system, he had been able to access their final thoughts and feelings, discovering that even in death, they had hoped their sacrifices might someday contribute to something larger and more meaningful than the individual conflicts they had experienced. Dr. Chun says the next phase of integration will involve expanded educational programs, Raymond said as they walked through sections of the garden where human children played alongside young members of the refugee species. Teaching human children about interspecies cooperation and giving them early exposure to the biological communication system, so they'll grow up thinking of it as natural rather than strange or frightening. The sight of children from different species playing together and sharing experiences through the biological network provided perhaps the most hopeful glimpse of humanity's future. These children would grow up in a world where cooperation between different forms of intelligence was not just possible but normal, where conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than force, and where the knowledge and perspectives of multiple species would be available to address challenges that no single civilization could handle alone. As the sun set behind the memorial garden, Raymond and Margaret made their way home to the same house where this extraordinary journey had begun. The morning coffee ritual continued, though now Raymond's understanding of their shared life carried depths and perspectives that enriched every moment. The simple pleasure of a quiet morning with his wife had been transformed from a refuge from his troubled memories into a celebration of all the beauty and meaning that careful cooperation could create. The strange wound on his arm had become a symbol of hope rather than fear, a reminder that what appears threatening at first glance might actually be an invitation to growth and transformation. Through accepting that invitation, Raymond Ellis, soldier, husband, and reluctant ambassador, had helped his species take its first steps toward joining a community of civilizations that had learned to survive and thrive through the simple but profound recognition that understanding between different forms of intelligence is not just possible, but essential for the long-term survival of any species wise enough to seek it.